In the quiet dawn of the eucalyptus forest, a tiny joey named Lira clung to her mother's fur, unaware that the world around her was about to change. For generations, these forests have been the cradle of life, their leaves whispering lullabies to koalas under the southern stars. But when fire and drought swept through the land, little Lyra's journey became a story of courage, of the gentle hands that reached out to save her, and of the bonds that connect us all: people, land, and the wild hearts we protect. Sometimes the smallest heartbeat carries the greatest hope. At first light, the town of Warrigal wore its Sunday best hush, though it was only a weekday. Shopfront blinds still down, a chalkboard outside the bakery promising lamingtons once the ovens cooled, and a high, brittle sky, the color of old porcelain, stretched above roofs, bleached by a summer that had overstayed its welcome. On the highway verge, the fire danger dial, an oversized rainbow of worry, pointed to extreme, and a north wind, warm as a hairdryer, combed red dust along the bitumen and into thirsty gutters. Beyond the town's last post and rail fence, the paddocks lay dun and crisp. Dams shrunk to sullen saucers, mirroring a sun not yet visible but already felt. And on the ridge, the eucalypts lifted their narrow leaves edge on to spare themselves the coming blaze of noon, their trunks mottled like the hides of old horses. Magpies warbled with a tired cheerfulness from power lines, and a kookaburra gave one solitary crack of laughter, as if to say, "Not much to laugh about, mate, but we'll try." In that shared mood, the country breathed, holding in its breath the way households held onto the last centimeters of water, in rain tanks, and the last minutes of cool before heat set in. Up behind Warrigal, where the asphalt petered to gravel, and the gravel to ochre dirt, the Warrigal Range rose like a weathered shoulder shouldering the sky, a long back of granite and ironstone freckled with stringy bark and mountain ash. And in one fold of that back, a small world stirred. A joey named Lira, 7 months old and still learning the etiquette of trees, clung to a low fork as the wind thumbed through leaves above her. Her fur was the soft gray of smoke shaken from a campfire blanket, and on her forehead a neat crescent of white lay like a moon caught and forgotten after dawn. Some keepers would have called it a blaze, but on Lira it looked like a promise. Her eyes were the inquisitive brown of tea, steeped just right, ringed with velvet shadows that made every glance seem astonished, and her paws, dark and careful, tested bark with a surgeon's attention. Curious by constitution, yet shy by experience, she stretched, wobbled, and hugged the trunk anew, feeling in the ridges of wood the slow pulse of a life larger than hers. Below her, the mother who had been weather and world to Lira, for as long as memory could string moments together, breathed in the day, and breathed out a patience tested by months of leanness. Mara, broad of chest for a koala, with the calm weight of a matriarch, and the frayed edges of an animal drawn thin by drought, had a face both serene and stern, tufted ears fraying into silver at the rims, and a nose scarred lightly from an old tumble when the branch that looked solid had been hollow as a politician's promise. Where Lyra's crescent shone like a new coin, Mara wore the matte patina of things used well and long, and there was a steadiness about her that suggested she could wait out a storm or a foolish idea with the same gentle refusal to be hurried. Yet the past 2 seasons had left lines in her, not chalked on so much as woven into how she moved, deliberately, as if counting energy like coins in a jar, and choosing with care where to spend them, a trait common to mothers in hard years, whether their cradles are woven or bark. The forest they called home was both generous and exacting, a complicated hostess. The grove they occupied this week, home rolled in koala terms, wherever the leaves were right, was a blend of manna gum and blue gum, with a stubborn clutch of young wattle shouldering in at the edge like eager understudies. The leaves had grown tougher, the oils sharper, after months of scant rain, and that made meals more work and less pleasure. Still, sunrise brought small mercies. Dew beating along the undersides of leaves, a cool seam of air flowing down gully before the day's furnace roared. Mara guided Lira with movements so minimal they were nearly telepathic. The soft repositioning of a forepaw, the weight shifted a breath to the left, the pause that meant listen, the tiny chuff that meant no higher, not today. Lira, thrumming with the itch to explore, obeyed with all the scandalized dignity of the very young, tolerating advice right up to the edge of ignoring it, then returning to compliance, as if the detour had been her idea all along. Twice she overreached, and twice the bark bunched under her claws in warning, and twice she tucked in, chastened, resting her chin on the crook of her own arm, to watch ants skirmish along moss. Life at tree height did not lack for intrigue. An army of carpenter bees investigated a split in the trunk that had the tone of a perfect note, and a possum, low-slung and cinnamon, ghosted along a branch like a worried thought. Higher up, the leaves were full of whispers about the weather, the kind of leaf-tone gossip that runs through an ecosystem the way news runs through a town. So-and-so saw smoke on the eastern ridge. Such-and-such heard engines after midnight. The creek that never stops has stopped. Did you hear? Did you hear? Birds ferried these reports with matter-of-fact efficiency, and even the shy skinks twitching under leaf litter moved with a haste that suggested they'd recognized a date circled on a calendar no one had shown them. Below, on the service road that laced the ridgeline, there came, faint at first, and then insistently distinct, the cough and growl of engines. Diesel-throated, purposeful, the mechanical equivalent of boots laced tight. Warrigal's Country Fire Authority had been out before dawn, checking tracks, clearing deadfall, tonguing the air for trouble. One truck rattled past the distant verge of the grove, and though its red and white flanks were broken by trees from where Lira huddled, the sound balled itself into her chest like thunder. Even Mara tilted an ear, the only concession she gave the human world, unless it pressed itself upon her. Long experience had taught her that engines on a morning like this meant something in the country had grown tinder-dry and temperamental. Yet not all omens were grim. Between one drone of machinery and the next, a wind shift revealed the faintest ribbon of moisture. And for a minute, maybe two, the cool breath of some shaded gully visited their branch. In that brief reprieve, Lyra's shoulders unknotted, and she leaned into Mara's flank, feeling through fur the reliable metronome of her mother's heart. It had been a narrow season, but the beat endured, a patient drum reminding her that life was a long song made from many measures, some stormy, some sweet, and none to be rushed. The morning unrolled, stitch by careful stitch, heat rising, insects scribbling a fine, bright script in the air, the sun tugging sequins of resin from the bark, so the trunks glittered with a miser's chapel kind of splendor. From the town came faint human noises. Bins dragged, a shutter clacked open, a radio murmuring cricket scores, because even in heat there was talk of wickets and runs. On a far paddock, an elderly kelpie barked half-heartedly at a mob of sheep, as if to satisfy the paperwork of duty without believing anything could be improved. And above it all, the forest placed one leaf upon another in precise green hierarchies, making shelter and food and shade and the architecture of everything that crawled, leapt, or flew. Throughout, Lira practiced, because practice is the quiet religion of the young. She learned the geometry of the fork that would hold her weight and of the one that would not, the proper clasp of the left hand over the right when descending, the way a tail can be ballast. If you remember it's there, the right moment to rest so that strength arrives back in time for the next ask. Once she paused to peer down her own nose at the moon of white between her eyes, as if surprised to find that mark still belonging to her, and not some trick of light. When she blinked, she did so gravely, like a magistrate signing a decree. She smelled the world in layers, oil, bark, dust, the faint sweetness of a wattle blossom forcing itself early, the ghost of smoke that had no flame yet in sight. Each scent wrote another sentence in the story her body would remember long after her mind forgot. Mara, in the measured economy of mothers who have seen both plenty and not enough, trimmed her own motion to the necessary and gifted her surplus attention to the Joey. Sometimes you keep little ones alive by feeding them, and sometimes by teaching them to feed themselves, sometimes by warding off the immediate danger, and sometimes by teaching them to recognize a far-off one. She did both as the morning grew old, steering Lira to fresher tips, keeping her below the line beyond which a slip would be expensive, and pausing to doze only when Lyra's curiosity folded into a drowsy bundle that could be parked on a safe shelf of bark. A wedge-tailed eagle rounded the ridge once and thought better of it. A pair of young rosellas quarreled over a knothole with an indignation too colorful for the hour. The wind rehearsed being a gale, then went back to being merely rude. And then, as if some unseen conductor had raised a baton, the day changed key. The north wind hardened, snapping at the canopy. The engines returned closer now, their notes layered with the chirp of two-way radios. And from the far flank of the range, a skein of birds lifted, a troubled suture of black shapes sowing sky to horizon, starlings and ravens and currawongs risen abruptly, as if called to a meeting no one wished to attend. The air acquired a taste like a coin held too long on the tongue, metallic and dry, and though no flame yet crowned the trees, even Lira, innocent as a hymn, felt the body's ancestral file open to the page marked caution. She pressed closer to Mara, and Mara, whose patience had room for one more lesson this morning, and then no more, cupped the curve of her with a forearm and drew her nearer. On the road a siren chattered briefly, 3 polite words exchanged among machines, then fell silent. The kookaburra laughed again, once without mirth, and somewhere toward town, the big dial would be nudged from extreme to catastrophic if the wind clipped one more notch. None of that the koalas knew in human terms, but they knew the forest's version, which was sufficient. A stillness in the wrong places, a stir in the right ones, the grammar of leaves changing tense. In that suspended moment, the grove held 2 truths at once. The tender, comic gravitas of a joey, discovering the physics of a branch under her own weight, and the fragile, flammable dignity of a country ripening toward trouble. Love, in such places, was the practice of paying attention, of knowing when to climb and when to cling. So the morning ended as it had begun, with a lesson. Lyra's paws reading bark like braille, Mara's breath a lullaby revised to fit a harsher tune, and the faint growl of engines threading the spaces between trees, while above the canopy a black ribbon of birds wrote a warning on the wide white page of the sky. By late afternoon, the north wind had sharpened to a blade, and the range wore a skim of yellow light as thin as varnish. Heat sat on the ridge like a squatter who wouldn't move on, and the gums clicked softly in their own strange language while, far below, Warrigal's pub leaned into knockoff hour with its doors propped open, and a chalkboard bragging about Parmas, and a raffle for the volunteer fireys. Up on the service road, a dusty white ute rolled to a stop beside a gate speared through with sun, and a young ranger hauled himself out, stretching his back as if it had opinions. Finn O'Connor had the practical hands of someone who grew up fixing things before they broke, square-palmed and nicked along the knuckles, and a jawline that looked as though it had been planed by the same tool his father used to shape fence posts. Dark blonde hair clipped short against the heat, a day's stubble shadowing the lower half of a face made older by worry than his 27 years deserved. People said Finn was easy company, quick with a grin, slower with judgment. But there was an inwardness to him too, a habit of listening to radios and birds with the same attention. That came, perhaps, from the summer when he was 12, and lightning walked across the paddocks near their old place outside Ballarat. When his dad's shed went with the flames, and the family dog, a blue heeler called Moxie, didn't make it out. Ever since, Finn kept a private ledger where he balanced small kindnesses against old scorch marks. He checked the CFA bulletin on his phone, ran a hand along the Utes' bonnet, then shouldered his patrol pack. First aid, a soft, Joey pouch, a vacuum flask of weak tea that tasted like every ranger's midnight, and set off along the track as the day slid into the color of burnt apricots. The wind carried a metallic tang, and he could hear engines elsewhere on the ridge, like distant lawnmowers at the edge of a dream. The forest tilted in the wrong direction, as if leaning to hear something coming. Finn moved with an economy learned from long, hot seasons. Torch clipped, radio low, steps placed where leaf litter would argue least. He had a kind word for every tree he passed. A habit, too. "How you going, old girl?" To a stringy bark with a seam like a stitched wound. "Hang in there, mate!" To a manna gum, browning at the tips. When full dark came, it arrived with the suddenness of a dropped curtain, cicadas switching on, as if someone had flicked the bush's master light. His torch plaited trunks and branches in quicksilver, and picked out the small lives of the night. A skitter of skinks, a huntsman spider as big as his palm proving a point about who really owned the path, and a brush-tail possum whose face beamed the precise expression of a disgruntled landlord checking overdue rent. Finn's radio crackled with clipped exchanges. Crews on the eastern spur, a watch and act issued for a patch of old growth, nothing immediate on his quadrant. And he answered with that laconic country etiquette that wastes no syllables. Just enough to say, "I'm here. I'm looking. Keep me in the book." In the canopy, a shape resolved out of shadow. Two shapes, one broad and deliberate, one small and tremulous. Mara had chosen a notch where the trunk forked into two sound limbs, a mother's calculus of angles and escapes. Lira, cradled against that decision, blinked into torchlight with the ceremonial solemnity of a judge surprised in chambers. Finn eased the beam lower to spare their eyes. He could make out the Joey's little face, furred in gray dusk. The crescent of white on her brow like a smudge of moon no one had had the heart to wipe off. "Evenin', little one," he said softly, and the words lifted a memory from a long shelf. The first time he'd seen a Joey up close, a wallaby pouchling blinking at him with astonishment that the world should include him at all. He kept a respectful distance. A ranger is a guest in every story not his own, and he knew it. The wind went restless again, rattling leaves, and somewhere not far off, a branch let go with the sound of a match being struck. The scent of smoke was still ghostly, more rumor than fact, but it threaded through the gums like gossip. Finn logged the sighting. 2 koalas, adult female and dependent Joey, healthy but alert, location pinned, and stood there a moment longer than procedure demanded. He wasn't superstitious exactly, but he had learned to take omens where he found them. And here, in the tight geometry of a mother's embrace, he saw a version of the country he preferred. Not the making do of drought or the manic arithmetic of fire, but the old, homely patience of life taking its time. On his way back to the Ute, he surprised a fox, rangy and red as an embarrassment. It paused, ironic and unafraid, then slid away into undergrowth like a bad thought leaving a meeting. Finn made a note to lay traps with the pest control team next week. If there was a next week that felt like this one, and not a week with a name that would later show up in funding submissions and memorial plaques. Downslope, a flicker teased the corner of his vision. He stopped dead, cut the torch, and let his eyes drink the dark. For 3 long breaths, there was nothing but the noise of his own heart. Then, a thread of orange unwound itself among fallen leaves and went out again, a false start of flame, or maybe only a heat-drunk trick of light. Still, the prudence drilled into him by seasoned fireys rose like a hand. Call it in, check it out, trust your nose. He circled, sniffed, felt with the back of his hand near the ground for warmth, the way an old shearer checks for a fever in a ram. The earth was hot from the day, but not yet mean. He logged that too, and climbed back toward the notch where he'd seen the koalas last. More to be sure of them than any procedural reason. They had shifted slightly, Mara higher, Lira lower, the Joeys. paws hugged into the bark, as if it were an old friend she was reluctant to hug too tight. And the wind's tune had changed key, picking up a warble like a kettle nearly ready to boil. "I'm around if you need me," Finn told the day's last light, as if speaking to the whole ridge, and turned for home with a ranger's practiced reluctance. Back at the Ute, a senior volunteer from the Warrigal CFA, a woman named Maureen Pike, pulled up alongside to compare notes. Maureen was in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair cut short under a cap, bleached to near white, laugh lines that hadn't been frightened off by bad seasons, and forearms like the rolled timbers of the old footbridge in town. She had come up through a lifetime of fundraising barbecues and nighttime call-outs, thick-skinned where necessary and soft-spoken, where kindness did more work. "Evening, Finn," she said, and her voice had the dry humor of a person who has seen all varieties of optimism and does not discourage any of them. He told her what he'd seen. She told him the eastern spur looked jumpy, but was behaving itself so far. They traded the weather like football stats, both aware that weather won every season in the end. "Keep your pouch handy," Maureen said, looking toward the trees with an expression you might wear when scanning a crowd for an old friend. "Hot wind like this makes fools of us all." Finn nodded, set the pouch where his hand would find it without asking his eyes for help, and watched as Maureen's truck rattled away into the long mauve of evening. On the ridge, the kookaburra gave another short, doubtful laugh. In town, someone revved a motorbike hard, like trying to outshout the future. And in the notch of the manna gum, a mother shifted her weight from one certainty to another, while a Joey, in love with the world and fearful of it, learned the first real rule of country life. That night arrives, and so does morning. And between them, you are yourself, if you're lucky, and if something bigger than luck allows. The wind ran a finger along the ridgeline, looking for a loose thread. The engine's uprange hummed like bees, thinking too loudly. And under a sky salted with stars, Finn O'Connor drove toward town slow enough to keep his promises, fast enough to keep watch, a ranger and his little ledger of debts and blessings, while somewhere in the boughs above, Lira tucked her head against her mother and slept with one ear open to the grammar of the leaves. Morning arrived early, and without mercy, as if the sun had slept in its boots. By 9, the range rang with heat, and the air had the shimmer of a mirage you couldn't outrun. Finn, called out before breakfast by a terse update, smoke columns sighted on the eastern flank, took the service road with the window down and the radio up. Warrigal behind him was already full of small heroics. Sprinklers arcing over rose bushes, hoses snaked across driveways, kids shepherded inside with promises of icy poles later. On the ridge, the fire began the way so many do in hard seasons, not as a roaring beast, but as a cunning whisper. Embers marching on grass too tired to protest, tongues of flame sampling deadfall, one tree convincing the next that heat is a language worth answering. Crews worked the flanks, men and women in yellow like a band of sunflowers who'd learned to move. Maureen's voice came clean over the scanner. All business now. The kindness in it honed to a cutting edge. The breeze that had been a bully all week became something worse. A collaborator. In the grove where Mara and Lira had slept, if sleep can be counted in a night full of listening, the light went gold, then orange, then wrong. Mara, who had seen bad days before, drew Lira down, branch by branch, with the grave precision of a surgeon. There are times to teach and times to carry, and this was a carrying time. But in the scramble, a limb that had been faithful for decades gave with the sound of old timber remembering its age. And Lira, startled into a leap beyond her schooling, found herself clinging to bark that peeled like loose paint. She slid, caught, slid again, and fetched up on a lower spur where the world looked suddenly too large. Heat came not as a touch, but as an argument, each breath an essay on what air might be if it forgot how to be kind. Finn was on foot before his ute had properly stopped. He shouldered his pack, checked for the Joey pouch with the superstitious pat of a man who knew things go missing at the exact moment you need them, and moved under a sky that had chosen the color of emergency. The fire hadn't yet crowned in their section, but it was thinking hard. Spot fires flickered like thoughts you couldn't shake. As he reached the grove, he saw the dark commas of koala shapes, the punctuation marks of their lives against the run-on sentence of the forest. Mara high, Lira low, and the gap between them full of everything that could go wrong. "Good girl," he said to the air as if the air could be persuaded to be kinder. He spoke low, steady, the way you talk to panicked horses and your own heart. He eased beneath Lyra's branch, jacket shrugged off, pouch ready, and offered the small ritual of safety. A folded blanket smelling faintly of eucalyptus oil, the cradle of his forearms, the refusal to hurry except where hurrying is the same as help. Lira, who had not yet learned how to assign trust, and so assigned it to the voice that stayed calm, loosened, one paw, then another, testing the physics of rescue. Finn felt the weight of her as an answer, not much more than a bag of oranges, but all the weight in the world if you consider what it represented. A future. Above them, Mara watched with a concentration that made time smaller. The first hot gust licked the canopy as if searching for salt. Leaves shivered, and somewhere upslope, a tree spoke fire's name, and meant it. "We go, sweetheart," Finn said, to Lira, or to himself, or to the god of small mercies. He snugged the Joey into the pouch, so only her eyes and the white crescent showed. A tiny lunar phase peering from canvas night, then backed away along the line he'd memorized without meaning to the night before. On the track, a CFA unit nosed into the grove, tires spitting grit. The crew leader, a compact man in his 40s, with a cricket player's easy balance and a day's soot worked into the seams of his grin, leaned out. Jackson Jacko Reed, born and weathered locally, the sort who can read a wind shift like other men read a line out. "Got a bub?" he called, already reaching for a spare blanket. "And a mum," Finn said, tilting his head up. Jacko's eyes flicked treeward, did the arithmetic of risk and time. "We'll get a long line on that side. Keep it nipping. Can you clear with the Joey?" Finn nodded, and Jacko, all economy now, set his team into motion. One hose team to paint the trunks wet, one to kick dirt across embers like stamping out a quarrel, one to keep eyes on the crown for any ember spot that thought itself clever. Heat found new keys to play, higher and more insistent. As Finn moved downslope, cradling the pouch, a pair of sulfur-crested cockatoos exploded from a nearby tree, their sulfur crests like furious question marks. A wallaby bounded across the path with the desperate bounce of a parent who knows it can't carry all it loves. The bush was full of departures. They made the ute, Lyra's breath loud in the small cave of canvas, her eyes two dark beads sowing fear into Finn's shirt front. He settled her on the passenger seat, wedged the pouch so it wouldn't slide, cracked the window to the exact measure a ranger learns from 100 rescues. Then, he took one more look upslope, where Mara clung in a silhouette that might have been carved into the day. Jacko's crew found a rhythm, the hose lines a choreography of insistence, and for a moment there was a sense that this patch, at least, might be argued back from disaster. "We'll keep the old girl shaded," Jacko shouted without turning, voice clipped by the war of noise, but carrying the promise of men who mean it. Finn flashed a thank you and rolled, slow at first to keep shocks from the Joey, then faster as the radios began to carry less talk and more command. Down in town, the refugee team had already spun up their quiet miracles. Karinya Wildlife Refuge was a squat cluster of weatherboard and corrugated iron tucked behind a line of river-red gums, its paint faded by the democratic sun of 100 summers. It had the feel of places that do hard work without applause, tidy but not fussy, clean but forgiving, with handwritten labels on cupboards, and a smell that was a cordial of straw, disinfectant, and eucalyptus leaves. Finn pulled in, and was met by a volunteer in her early 20s who moved like someone who'd been told to hurry all day and was still finding ways to be gentle. She took one look at the pouch and stepped aside to clear a bench, her freckles standing out sharp against pale skin, reddened by the bite of the sun. "Dr. Burns on her way," she said. "Pop her here." Finn slid the pouch onto a folded towel, hands reluctant to let go. Lira, whose world had shrunk to the size of a smell and a voice, watched with the ferocious concentration of the truly young, every new sound a possible alphabet of threat or comfort. "She's been separated from the dam," Finn said, unconsciously dropping into the bush, shorthand for mother. "Up on the range. Fire's just having a think about crowning." The volunteer, Hannah, he learned when she pinned a name badge back onto her shirt with a sigh that suggested it habitually tried to make a run for it, nodded, and set a heat pad under the towel, a small son domesticated to kindness. Sirens murmured somewhere else in town. The sky over Warrigal kept the same wrong color. Finn felt the day in his bones like a weight he could carry, but not put down. In the pouch, Lyra's eyelids drooped, lifted, drooped again. The white crescent on her brow seemed to glow, as if the moon had come early to watch over the day. Karinya took Lira in the way a harbor takes a small boat after bad weather, without ceremony, but with relief stitched into every motion. The intake room was a simple square under a whirring fan, its walls busy with laminated charts that made sense of marsupial mysteries. Pouch temperatures, feeding schedules, leaf preferences scribbled with local notes like manna from the creek bend, best after rain. The door banged once, and Dr. Sienna Byrne shouldered through, glasses sliding down the neat line of her nose, a stethoscope around her neck, like a habitual question she kept asking the world. Sienna was in her mid-40s, with the rangy fitness of someone who runs before dawn, because the day leaves no other hour. Her hair, a dark chestnut cut to the jaw, was pulled back in a no-nonsense clip, and there were pale crescents under her eyes that spoke of too many nights meeting the bush on its own terms. The lines around her mouth belonged to both laughter and worry in equal shares. People sometimes mistook her briskness for severity, but those who stuck around learned that her triage was not only for animals. She rationed tenderness like a valuable medicine, and when she gave it whole. "Talk to me," she said, already washing her hands. Finn summarized: range, separation, approximate age, hydration status by the look of the eyes, a mother still up a tree guarded by a good crew, and Sienna nodded through the details the way a pianist notes the chords in an old tune. She approached the pouch without fuss, voice low, palms open the way you greet a skittish foal. "Hello, Moonbrow," she murmured, and Lyra's eyes widened at the sound that had a smile hidden in it. "We'll be very boring for a while, you and I. Boring is safe." Examination was a choreography Sienna could have danced in her sleep. "Weigh the Joey." She called out numbers that Hannah wrote on a clipboard in a tidy, scholastic hand. Check mucous membranes. Assess dehydration with a pinch that lifted skin into a tent and watched it fall back. Listen to the small thunder of a heart made brave by necessity. Feel the belly for mischief. "We'll warm her slowly. None of this hero business," Sienna said, sliding a heat pad under the pouch to the exact place where warmth becomes kindness, and not harm. Then, 1 to 2 mL oral rehydration on the hour, leaf samples for scent comfort. If she's got a dam still alive up there, we're not rehoming a personality, we're babysitting a reunion. Finn felt something unclench in his chest. He hadn't noticed, had tightened. He watched Sienna the way a person watches a tradeswoman mend a thing, the household thought beyond repair. In the parking area beyond the open window, a gust slung grit across the concrete and brought with it the smoke-salt stink of the range, a reminder that safe rooms float like islands, and islands can shrink. Sienna glanced toward the window, then back to work. "You eaten?" she asked, without looking up, and when Finn said no, she told Hannah to fetch the biscuit tin from the staff room, the one labeled, "Vets are not machines." and to make 2 mugs of tea with milk, because tea is a lever that moves more of the day than you'd think. Lira, head peeking like a new moon from the lip of the pouch, steadied under the quiet business of care. The human voices had a cadence that did not ask anything of her. And the smells here: clean linen, a scatter of gum leaves crushed for comfort. The animal musk of old patience faded to memory, stacked up into a sort of lullaby. Sienna took a eucalyptus sprig from a jar, bruised it gently to free the oils, and set it near Lyra's nose. The joey inhaled, eyes softening, language returning to her body through scent. "Good," Sienna said, not to be congratulated, but as a receipt written for hope. She looked Finn over the rims of her glasses in a way that was professional first and kind second, which in her practice amounted to the same thing. "You did well on that hill," she said. "If you hadn't been gentle, she'd have gone to pieces." Finn shrugged, awkward with praise, and took the tea Hannah set by his elbow, the steam painting his face in domestic fog. "How's the dam likely to fare?" he asked. Sienna rolled one shoulder, a movement that acknowledged all the variables she couldn't muscle into line. "Koala mothers are stubborn old ships," she said. "They'll embargo, giving up until their hulls split. If the crew keeps the crown in check, and she can find a cooler gully, she'll hold. We'll put up a notice with CFA to watch that tree when it's safe." She scribbled on the chart, printed, then softened her voice. "If we reunite them, it will be quick. The little ones know the dam's smell the way you know a song your grandmother sang." In the courtyard, a battered esky yawned open to show cut stems swaddled in damp towels. Leaf menu for picky eaters who'd had a week of bad dining. Hannah brought in a tray of fresh manna gum like a florist and set it in a vase by the heat lamp, a domestic altar to chlorophyll. Sienna showed Finn the trick of a slow feed. Hold the syringe like a pen. Tilt just so. Never flood. Let the joey swallow decide the cadence. Lyra's small mouth worked, the movement tentative, then eager, then drowsy. For a few minutes the room held that miracle common in clinics everywhere. Time obeyed the pace of healing instead of schedules. News from the ridge arrived in small, skittish animals called texts. Jacko's crew had kept the line. A wind change promised in the late afternoon might either bless or curse them. Maureen had sent down 2 ringtails, whose whiskers looked like ash-dusted wire, and were presently scandalized by the accommodations. Through it all, Sienna kept Lyra's world boring, and so safe. "We'll give her a quiet enclosure, dim light," she said. "No heroics for 24 hours. If the dam is alive, and the fire gods aren't feeling mean, we'll try a reunification run with you tomorrow or the next day." She glanced at Finn with a sidewise smile that acknowledged the superstition of saying plans aloud in bad fire weather. "Assuming," she added, "the calendar hasn't got other opinions." Afternoon sloped toward evening. Someone out front hosed the dust down with water that hissed on hot concrete like a snake being persuaded off a path. In town, the pub would be filling again with the peculiar solidarity of a place that knows the names of its trouble and toasts them anyway. Finn wrote his number on the whiteboard under Ranger Contacts, even though it was already there, a gesture like straightening a picture frame in a room you don't own. He stood at the window longer than necessary, watching a family of galas mob a birdbath with the absurd ceremoniousness of dignitaries at a ribbon cutting. "Go sleep," Sienna said finally, seeing in his stance the particular fatigue of people who imagine they can be in 2 places at once if they just stand correctly. "We'll watch her. If anything changes, you'll hear." Finn hesitated, then nodded. He put a finger to the pouch's rim in a farewell that did not touch, then stepped out into the evening, which had the overlit look of a day refusing to acknowledge it was over. Behind him, in the quiet he left, Lira breathed the warm air of the heat lamp and the cooler air that leaked around the edges of the effort to make a summer behave. The scent of bruised eucalyptus brushed the inside of her nose with memory. In her small, brave chest, her heart made a promise it couldn't understand and would keep anyway. By morning, the refuge had the industry of a shearing shed in spring, quiet hands doing necessary things without fuss. And Lira, whose world the day before had been bark and wind, and the tense grammar of leaves, woke to a different kind of forest, made of shelves and clean towels, and the kind voices of people who had taught their faces to be calm. She lay in the warm half-light of her enclosure, a low pen draped with shade cloth to make the day behave like late afternoon, and watched as a kangaroo joey, the color of milky tea, regarded her over the lip of the next pen with the delighted impertinence of the very young. His name, delivered with fond exasperation by Hannah, was Jiro. He was 8 months old, long-legged and lop-eared, with a belly that hadn't quite caught up to his knees, and a habit of testing boundaries the way a musician tests a note. Just a little flat, just a little sharp, then right on the money. A pale crescent scar nicked the fur along his left hip, the memento of a fence he'd misread in a paddock that had neither shade nor forgiveness, and it had left him with a skittish bravery. Jump first, think later, then look apologetic and jump again. Hannah herself arrived bearing a tray like a waiter at a country wedding. Tiny syringes labeled in neat texta, a ceramic bowl of chopped leaf tips, a thermometer that beeped with bedside manners. And she looked the way kindness looks when it's too busy to pose. Hair the color of summer wheat, coiled into a messy bun that had opinions of its own, a smudge of leaf oil at her wrist, freckles constellationed across cheeks heated pink by the morning's hosework. She moved with tenderness, learned the hard way, the kind that holds steady when an animal panics and laughs on the other side of the door so the fear won't think it's invited back. "Morning, Moonbrow," she told Lira, whose white crescent shone faintly in the soft light. "We're trying the good stuff, fresh manna tips from the creek line, and nobody's allowed to judge anyone's table manners before coffee." At the word coffee, another figure appeared in the doorway. A kookaburra, ruffled as if wearing a bad suit, parked itself on the gum outside and issued the sort of one-note judgment peculiar to birds who think your day needs editing. Hannah tossed it a look that said, "We've discussed this, mate," and the bird withdrew with the dignity of a critic who has decided to be generous. Not long after, a man in his early 30s with a face divided neatly between cheerfulness and fatigue backed through the door with an armful of fresh-cut branches. This was Trent McAvoy, groundsman and fixer of everything at Karinya, built like a farm gate, broad, functional, and likely to still be there after storms. His skin was the permanent tan of someone who lives outdoors, his black hair cut short and obedient, and a thin line of white puckered the skin along his right forearm, where a chainsaw had once argued with him and lost. He had the odd-job serenity of men who can mend pumps at noon and coax a feral cat into a carrier at 1, and whose politics, if asked, amounted to, people should have water and animals shouldn't be on fire. "Leaf bars open," he announced, shouldering the door closed with the care of a man who had learned the hard way that doors bite. "Picked along the creek, where the shade still remembers rain." He raised an eyebrow at Jiro, who had already demonstrated a university-level interest in other people's breakfast. "And you, Professor, have your own menu." The refuge's quiet choreography unfurled. Hannah checked Lyra's temperature, warm, but not worryingly so, then showed Finn, who had slept 4 hours and looked better for it, how to bruise a leaf to release its scent, a green perfume that braided memory through the room. Sienna passed like weather, arriving, changing things, making conditions more favorable, and her brisk voice stitched commentary into the air. "Small volumes many times. Boredom is medicine. Watch for stress yawns. Joeys read your heartbeat, so don't let them think yours is writing a thriller." Finn, careful as if learning to hold a new kind of silence, fed Lira with the patience he wished someone had taught him when he was 12, and counting the minutes while a blue healer burned behind a shed. He had not spoken of Moxie to anyone here, not because he could not, but because the bush writes elegies on its own schedule, and he'd learned to read them without moving his lips. When Lira slept, He leaned against the doorframe and watched Jiro being an argument made of springs. The Joey practiced hops along the safe length of his pen, turning at each end with the concentration of a tightrope walker at a street fair, then stopped dead to sniff the empty air as if listening for a cue only he could hear. When Trent laughed, a low, easy sound, Jiro bounced twice more as if accepting applause. Later, a schoolteacher from town arrived with 2 Year 9 students delivering a grocery box for the volunteers. Biscuits, long-life milk, a bag of mandarins that smelled like holidays. And the teacher, a tall woman with gray-streaked curls and a voice that could call over an oval, whispered to Hannah, as if in church, that half the class had wanted to come. The 2 teenagers stood awkwardly at the threshold, eyes wide, learning the kind of lesson that isn't in their curriculum but should be. And Hannah, who remembered being their age and wanting to be useful, put them to work, cutting towel squares and writing labels no one would read but would miss if absent. Through the day, the refuge held its peculiar calm, a stillness braided from practice and purpose. A ringtail involved in a melodrama about pellets versus fresh fruit. A gala in recovery informing everyone of its opinions. A turtle blinking like an old philosopher considering the folly of being round. Sienna stopped to teach a brief seminar in How Not to Be Interesting to a room full of volunteers, by which she meant how to make your presence a background hum that animals accept as weather. Then stepped back into the river of tasks. In a lull, she found Finn standing at the doorway of Lira's pen, the ranger's hat held against his leg, as if hats have hearts and should be kept informed. "She's writing you into her map," Sienna said without poetry, which made the sentence more true. "Be careful. The map gets to choose when it erases you." "Understood," he said, thinking of reunions and the ache they give before they heal. The wind by late afternoon lost its mean edge, backhanding the trees instead of punching them. The scanner bled cautious good news. Containment on the eastern spur holding. Crews rotating to wetline and watch edges. That fickle wind trend line bending away like a guest reconsidering another drink. Then came the message that changed the air in the room, the way a key change lifts a song. Maureen's voice, worn but pleased, reporting that a team northeast, over toward the cooler gullies shadowed in the long reach of granite, had found an adult female koala with a torn claw casing and soot on her ruff, dehydrated but not broken, positioned like a prayer in a black butt that had refused to carry flame. Identifying marks matched the notes Finn had logged. Broad chest, silver frayed ears, and a manner like a ship that didn't sink because it couldn't countenance the admin. Finn closed his eyes a beat too long for comfort, and when he opened them, Sienna had already begun to organize the world around the idea of a reunification. Hydrate the dam, monitor her breathing, keep humans uninteresting, schedule a quiet hour when the air would be cooler and the leaf menu irresistible. "Not tonight," Sienna said, pragmatic and hopeful in the same breath. "Tomorrow, or the day after, if the crews keep the devil on his leash." She wrote on Lira's chart a sentence as plain as marching orders. Probable reunification within 48 hours. And then, because she was not superstitious, but respected those who were, drew a little box around the words, as if to keep luck from reading them. Evening tipped its hat. The refuge lights hummed soft as bees. Jiro fell asleep mid-bounce with his chin on a rolled towel, the scar on his hip pale as chalk. Lira dreamed leaf-scent dreams, paws twitching, the crescent on her brow a low ember that cast no shadow. Outside, the kookaburra took up a new post and watched the roofline like a security guard with a sense of humor. Finn washed his hands of the day at the sink and felt that peculiar lightness the body gets when a weight has not been removed, but has at least been seen by other hands. "Tomorrow," he said, not to anyone in particular, and the room, busy with its own quiet vows, seemed to nod. The change came with the sort of coolness that makes a whole town sigh. Air slipping in off a distant sea nobody could see, the light losing its feral edge and learning to be gentle again. And Warrigal, which had spent days speaking in the tight sentences of caution, loosened its voice. In backyards, kids were let out with warnings about smoke and promises of early bedtimes. At the refuge, the hoses hissed less urgently, and the paddocks across the road stopped trying to look like kindling. Inside Karinya, Sienna's whiteboard acquired a new heading in her square, decisive hand. Reunion Run, Conditional. And beneath it, a shopping list of quiet. Cool hour, low human traffic, leaf bundle prepared from Dam's preferred species, transport crate padded and familiarized. Finn arrived early, a ranger's uniform turned into Sunday best by neatness rather than ornament. Stubble tamed, hair damp from a shower that had convinced his shoulders to rejoin his body. He carried a cloth bag that, when opened, revealed a folded blanket with the same eucalyptus note as Lyra's pouch. An olfactory chorus intended to tell the day that some parts of it were already decided. Sienna met him with a nod that contained both permission and expectation. "Our northern team has the dam in a holding tree in the cool gully off Maloon Track," she said, tapping a map where someone had drawn a little star. She took fluids. "Grip strong. No wheeze. We'll drive the long way to avoid the hot flank. We keep our voices small. If either party says no, we listen. This is a conversation, not a declaration." Hannah prepped the leaf bundle with the zeal of a chef plating for a critic. Fresh manna and ribbon gum tips, a sprig from the very creek line Trent had raided, and a handful of crushed leaves for scent cues. Jiro watched with the benign envy of a diner waiting for the next course, and was politely bribed with his own greens. Lira, tucked in the familiar pouch, blinked up at Finn with the solemnity of a magistrate asked to sign a document. He spoke to her in the tone he saved for difficult horses and frightened children. Low, even, making the air between them into a small room where nothing bad could fit. They set off in Karinya's van, which was as modest as everything else the refuge owned. White paint, chalked by the sun. A dashboard that rattled at certain speeds. But it rode steady, and Trent had tuned the engine so it breathed like a patient animal. Sienna drove with the alert calm of someone who understood that arriving in one piece is a kind of medicine. As they wound up Maloon Track, the bush showed its bandaged places. Black lips on logs where fire had kissed and let go. Leaves bronzed along edges. A mosaic of green and charcoal that the eye learned only with practice. Here and there, an absurdly cheerful wattle refused to acknowledge grief and went on blooming. A pair of gang cockatoos flighted overhead with their rusty door creak. The males, redhead, like a small flag of stubborn joy. The northern team waited in the gully. 3 people who looked like the bush had signed their clothes. Erin Tate, a compact woman in her late 30s, with hair the color of ironbark, and forearms annotated by small scars, all competence and patience. A younger bloke named Sol Nguyen, Vietnamese-Australian, 25, wiry and precise, who handled rope with a dancer's grace and had the ready grin of someone raised in a large family. And Pete Fossil Keegan, 60-something, a retired linesman with a beard like a weather chart and the taciturn benevolence of men who prefer engines to meetings. Fossil had the eyes of a man who'd seen 3 bad decades and kept the receipts. And the way he watched the canopy made you feel cataloged and safer for it. "Dam's there," Erin murmured, and indicated a black butt leaning like a tired teacher. Mara was settled in the second fork, posture minimalist, eyes tracking the humans the way a bank teller tracks coins. Counted, not loved. Even from below, Finn could see the silver fray of her ears and the steady, unsentimental intelligence of a mother who had recalibrated the world a dozen times and would do it again if the maths required. They made the meeting place into a chapel without announcing it. Voices cropped short, gestures small, boots placed on leaf litter, the way you place plates on a table that belongs to someone else. Sienna took Lyra's pouch and set it at the base of the tree, not directly under Mara, but near enough that scent could climb. She unrolled the leaf bundle and set it as if dressing an altar. then stepped back. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then everything did, in increments, as reunions tend to. Lira lifted her head and inhaled like a scholar opening a book she knows by heart. Her small body reorganized around a certainty older than fear. She scrabbled once, the pouch giving its murmured permission, then reached for bark with the decisiveness of one who has finally been told the right direction. Finn crouched, hands out, but not touching, the father to 100 rescues, and the owner of none. Mara, above, leaned into the smell of her own life returning. She shifted, slow as tides, and a soft, rolling chuff vibrated the air, the koala greeting that says, in their monosyllable, known. Lira climbed. Everyone pretended to be landscape. Saul's grin vanished into reverence. Aaron watched the pair like a nurse watching stitches hold. Fossil became a granite post with eyes. The distance between Joey and Dam shrank to a foot, a hand, a whisker, then vanished. Lira tucked herself into the place where bodies remember each other, under Mara's chin, between the plate armor of muscle and the velvet of fur, and the chuffing rose and fell like a prayer. Sienna did the last thing a good clinician does. Nothing. The next minutes were inventory and sacrament. Mara groomed soot from Lyra's brow with deliberate strokes. Lira kneaded the muscle along Mara's forearm, as if reassuring herself it would not evaporate. Finn listened to his own heart, slow to a civilized pace. Aaron scribbled times and observations because memory is loyal, but fallible. "We'll leave the leaf bundle," Sienna said finally, voice a thread. "We'll back out and set a watch from the track mouth. If they choose to move, we don't herd." Fossil inclined his head in the minimal absolution of old bushmen, and they withdrew along the path they had ironed flat with their own attention. At the track's mouth, the world remembered to be ordinary. Ants towing miracles under sticks, a breeze rediscovering the idea of cool, a ute door squeaking like a joke repeated once too often. Finn stood with his hands on the fence the way countrymen stand when they are having a feeling in public and require a prop. Sienna looked at him and saw the 12-year-old he had not had time to be. "Good ledger entry, Ranger," she said, and he managed a laugh that loosened something old. Back at the refuge, they wrote the notes that make the work legible to tomorrow. Time of reunion, condition of both animals, behavior, leaf uptake. Hannah drew a small moon next to Lyra's name, because she was 22, and hope asks for small art. Evening went up the range like a tide. The radios, for once, had more good news than bad. The kookaburra laughed in genuine amusement at something only birds understand. Finn drove home with the window down, and the road unwinding the tight coil of the past days. The town was itself again, in the way places are when they remember their jokes. Somewhere in the boughs above a gully, Mara and Lira arranged themselves for sleep, as if fitting two pieces of a tool back into the same box. Tomorrow would have its own requests. Tonight, the forest had returned a call. They waited a day to be sure, because patience is a kind of insurance in the bush. And when Aaron's text came with a picture that could have been a family portrait, Mara with her weight settled. Lira parked like a small comma at the safest place a sentence can hold. The refuge let itself exhale. Karinya's whiteboard acquired a new line in Sienna's hand. Post-reunion monitoring, light. And below it, a reminder to send thanks to the crews, because gratitude keeps engines running. Finn drove up to the ridge in the late morning, when shadows were generous, and the air was already learning its old trick of heat without menace. He parked at the mouth of the track and went on foot, alone now, because some farewells are private, not because they are secret, but because the world has earned one man's quiet. The forest had tidied itself, ash damped and sleeping, trunks charcoaled like charcoal meant it, undergrowth doing arithmetic with green. A wallaby raised its head from a patch of grass and decided Finn was a weather system, not a problem. At the Blackbutt, Mara held court, which is to say she ignored him with dignity. Lira did not ignore him, because youth is allowed to be rude with affection, and peered down with that solemn, infuriating curiosity that says, I know you, and I don't know you, and both are true. Finn touched the bark at the tree's base, the way townsfolk touch plaques. No superstition, just continuity. And said, Righto then, in the style of men who require the last word to be the least important. He left the leaf bundle freshened by Hannah an hour before, the sprigs cool from Trent's early raid, and turned back toward the track. Halfway down, he met Maureen, boots dusty, hat shadowing eyes that knew how to measure a day's good. She looked him over as if checking her mental inventory, and then nodded at the distant ridge where a new crew cut a break your grandchildren will walk without knowing why. Not bad, aye, she said, and the words contained a whole season of effort boiled down to a sip. Not bad at all, Finn said. In town that afternoon, Warrigal resumed the practical ceremonies of its life. The bakery window bloomed with lamingtons and curiosity slices. The pub chalked up meat tray winners and the amount raised for the fireys. A notice board sprouted handbills for a working bee at the Oval. Nobody made speeches about heroism, because speeches spoil the mood of places where everyone took their turn. At Karinya, Jiro performed an interpretive hop that suggested he had opinions about reunion protocols, namely, that all reunions should include him and possibly a biscuit. And Hannah laughed the kind of laugh that turns the lights up a notch. Sienna wrote emails to donors and notes to other refugees, and, after everyone else had gone, sat in her office with the door open and let the quiet come, sit in the spare chair. Toward evening, Finn went back up to the ridge one last time, because a ledger is a living thing, and he preferred to close rows in the same light they were opened. The sky wore its salt and honey colors, and the kookaburra found something genuinely hilarious in a patch of air. The fire danger dial in town had been turned down to high, which passes for mercy in a country built to burn and grow back. At the edge of the grove, he paused where he had stood the first night, a man listening to engines and leaves, and found the memory of that listening layered into the present. Above him, Mara shifted, a small adjustment of a seasoned captain taking soundings, and Lira pressed in with the entitlement of those who have rediscovered ownership. Finn took from his pocket the dry leaf he'd kept by accident and turned by intention, the way a boy keeps a marble to remind him of the alleyway where he learned to aim, and tucked it in the band of his hat. He had lost a dog at 12 and had been losing and finding things ever since, and he understood now that the business of country life is not to keep but to accompany. When he reached the ute, Jacko rolled in, Ash still living in the seams of his grin, hair crunched by the day's hat. He hopped out with the neat bounce of a man whose knees still believed his lies, and waved a stubby bottle of sports drink like a prize. Heard your girls found each other, Jacko said, and the plural belonged equally to Finn and the bush. Good ledger entry. Finn accepted the bottle and let the cold argue him back into ease. Yours too, he said. Lines held. Jacko shrugged in the modest way of men who say we, and never I. We got lucky early. Wind blinked. Trees remembered how to say no. They stood in the fellow silence of working people who don't need to explain the work. Pub? Jacko said eventually. I owe you a parma the size of a paddock. Rain check, Finn answered. Tomorrow, I'll have 2. He drove down in the blue hour, the ute's headlights carving their small certainty into bends that had seen worse. He passed the sign into town and thought of all the small signs no one builds. A white crescent on a brow, a Joey's weight in canvas, the downward turn of a wind just when it matters, the way a community accrues around a refuge until it is a refuge twice over. In the staff room at Karinya, he left a note on Sienna's desk. Reunited, monitoring good. Thanks for the boring. And a sprig of creekline leaf in a tin mug, a florist's arrangement scaled to the right size for truth. Night settled over Warrigal with a decency learned from long practice. The stars came out like screws, holding the dark in place. In the Blackbutt Gully, Mara slept, and Lira learned the meaning of the word home, which is only ever borrowed and always, always shared. Sometimes, the smallest heartbeat in the wild is the clearest reminder that the world still holds room for miracles. When Lira found her way back to Mara under the blackbutt trees of Warrigal, it wasn't just the work of rangers, firefighters, or kind hands at the refuge. It felt, in the hush of that moment, as if God's gentle breath had guided them through fire and fear back to each other. Here in Australia, we've all seen summers that test the land and the people who love it. We've also seen neighbors turn up at dawn with a hose, a fresh loaf of bread, or a ride to the hospital. In every one of those small, ordinary acts of care, there's a spark of the same grace that carried Lira home. If this story has touched your heart, we invite you to share it, so that hope may travel further than the fires ever could. Leave a comment about the kindness you've witnessed, in the bush, in the suburbs, or just next door. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories of courage, compassion, and the wild lives we share this country with, please subscribe to our channel. May the Lord bless and protect you and all creatures great and small, as we learn again that the land heals best when we care for one another.